Rolling.
Okay, so how do you describe electrosensitivity?
Electrical sensitivity is when people start reacting, their body starts reacting to electromagnetic fields. Generally speaking, the electromagnetic fields that they'll be reacting to is wireless. So it'll be wireless communications, it'll be Wi-Fi, it'll be cordless phones, deck phones, mobile phones, masts. All of them emitting signals that our body has never experienced before. And when people start to become affected, when I became affected, the way that it starts to affect you is, generally speaking, it's your head first, and it will start giving you pains in your head. But I hate to use the word headache, because it's pains in your head that is unlike any other headache you've ever had before.
Most people's complaints are things like cardiac arrhythmia, insomnia, headache, visual disturbance, vertigo, different kinds of paresthesias or neurasthesias where they are feeling unusual sensations within their body. But really it can also affect endocrine function, thyroid function. Again, the list is really endless.
In my particular case, and this is not everybody's case, if I then don't get out of the environment, I start getting quite severe pains in my gut, and that will then mean it's too late, and I will then start bleeding internally.
I think that the symptoms are so diverse, and the associations that people make are very difficult to accept if you have no knowledge of this subject, which most physicians do not have. And that's no fault of their own. We're not trained to recognise this condition. It's very innovative, and our understanding of it is entirely embryonic at this stage. We're at the very first steps of unravelling and fully understanding this condition.
Brian, like many sufferers of electrosensitivity, has been forced to make radical changes to his home.
These two rooms have been completely shielded in metal foil, so that this room and the bedroom are a Faraday cage. And if you actually check the electromagnetic fields, or indeed the microwaves, and this machine is simply converting microwaves to noise, you find that the mast that is about half a mile away over there, which causes me a problem, by shielding the room and putting metallized glass, means that I can eliminate most of the electromagnetic fields.
The aspects of an organism that allow it to detect and respond to electromagnetic fields, you could say this word's going to use it in a number of different contexts, and if you bisect it and break it down, electrically sensitive, you could say that really that's a response to life itself. In that, for example, if we're looking at an organism to determine the presence of life, we're really looking for the presence of electricity. So with the electrocardiogram, for example, the ECG, and the electroencephalogram, the EEG, what we're looking at there is the presence of electricity from those target organs, the brain and the heart. And when we see the presence of that, that's a sign that there's life. So in a way, given that on a cellular level, electromagnetic fields are part of life itself, we could say that all life is electromagnetically sensitive.
Desperate to convince people that electrosensitivity was genuine, Brian and a number of other sufferers signed up to a landmark experiment at Essex University. The experiment, run by Elaine Fox, would sadly become the definitive work on the subject.
You have to go into a shielded room, and you go in there for a relatively short period of time, and the mast is on for 10 minutes and off for 10 minutes and on for 10 minutes, and to see whether you can detect whether it's on or not. And I went into the room having told them that I would not be able to tell them whether the mast was on or off or on.
Why's that?
because their understanding of how you react to this is wrong. This is not a case with most people where you turn the mast on and, oh, I'm affected. They turn the mast off, oh, I'm okay again. It doesn't work like that. I suffer with hay fever. And when I go into a field where there's pollen, it takes a while before I'll be affected. But it takes a long time before I'm not affected. I can be removed from the hay field for 24 hours, but I'll still be feeling my hay fever. And electrical sensitivity with most people is a little bit like that.
The way the team had set up the experiment meant it would be almost impossible for Brian and the other volunteers to prove they were being affected. Not that it would matter, as the team had inexplicably decided to do away with any form of vetting procedure.
For one thing, people appear to be sensitive to different things. I'm sensitive to 3G mobile phones, I'm sensitive to GSM mobile phones, for example. There are differences in the way the modulation works. I have no idea whether they're right in their sensitivities, but if that is the case, then it makes sense that the people who you've got into your study claim to be sensitive to exactly the signal that you're going to be exposing them to. If you have someone that, for example, is always sensitive to Wi-Fi, but they're never sensitive to mobile phones, if they exist, then you make sure that what they're being exposed to is Wi-Fi and not mobile phones, because you're actually trying to prove whether they're sensitive to what they're saying they are. None of that differentiation was done. It was really, if you claimed to be sensitive to anything at all that happened to be electromagnetic, you were in.
Well, one of the reasons why I thought it was quite important was I help people who are electrically sensitive. And a couple of months before, I'd actually been to a lady's house who thought she was electrically sensitive, just to try and help her and to explain to her what electrical sensitivity was and what might be causing her a problem. And to cut a long story short, it was obvious that this particular lady had a problem, but she was not electrically sensitive. She was definitely not electrically sensitive. But in the going of the conversation, she'd signed up for the Essex trials to try and find out whether she was electrically sensitive. Well, my heart missed a beat. Well, here's somebody that's not electrically sensitive, and they've signed up to go to Essex, and Essex are telling me they don't have a vetting procedure.
What they actually found, and this is based on the text in their paper itself, I'm not sort of paraphrasing, is they needed, according to them, with the level of response they were expecting to see from sensitive people, they would need about 132 people, participants in their study, to show a statistically significant effect. That's how much population, if you like, they would need. That's how much data they would need in their study findings before they could say this group is clearly more sensitive than that group. What they got was 44. So from the very outset, they only had a third of the data they expected that they would need to find anything anyway. What they ended up finding was a near statistically significant risk anyway, i.e. the people who claimed to be sensitive showed that they were sensitive with a significance of about 90%. So the borderline at which a scientific paper says, yes, this is statistically significant, is 95%. If you don't get that level of certainty, it's not a statistical finding at all. It could be random chance and noise. They got something which was 90% certainty of an increase in risk, and of course it fails the magic bar at which you can call it a statistically significant result, and it was written off as a, this demonstrates that people aren't sensitive, when actually it did no such thing.
The constant exposure to the mast took its toll on a number of the volunteers, making some of them so sick they were forced to withdraw from the experiment. For Brian, the effects of the experiment will be felt long after he left Essex.
I've had, my first colonoscopy was 7 years ago, my second one was 4 years ago, my third one was about a year ago. There's nothing the matter with me, there's nothing the matter with me. Absolutely, you know, you're imagining it. I've got colon cancer. So, from the first time that I bled to the time of removing the polyp was 7 years. When I asked the doctor how long does it take to cancer to develop, 7 years. So you can virtually track the time when I went to Essex, and there was one occasion before where I started bleeding. With that bleeding has caused me colon cancer.
How could such a botched experiment be held up as such a definitive piece of research? Why would such an experienced team make such fundamental and obvious errors in their work? Could it be anything to do with those who provided the funding? The Essex experiment is one of a number of experiments funded by the MTHR, a company set up and funded by the mobile industry themselves. Could you explain what MTHR does and how MTHR is funded?
Yes, the MTHR programme is funded jointly by the UK government and the mobile telecommunications industry, and it funds research into possible adverse health effects related to mobile phone technology.
The whole issue of who funds scientific research is a thorny issue. I know many scientists like myself who, when they get a new study to read, the first thing they turn to is the back of the page where it says who funded it.
Is there, do you think, maybe a conflict of interest in the mobile phone industry funding research into the harm that it does?
Well, of course there is a potential conflict of interest, and that's why a programme of funding like this has to be carefully managed.
I've done a lot of work with the telecommunications industry because I happen to have I organise the communication workers representation in here, and so I've talked to these people for a long time. I think they would like to be objective, but they are driven, particularly in a market where they're fighting each other for market share by profit, and therefore they may fund research, but much like the pharmaceutical industry, you often find that they're hiring people who've already spoken on their side of the argument.
Scientists aren't pop stars, they don't earn a lot of money, they have houses to finance, they have families to look after. Who can blame them for recognising that if they find the wrong results, they're not going to get another job from that source at any rate?
There are psychological pressures, even in the absence of actual pressures, which may or may not be present in individual circumstances. There are clearly psychological pressures to conform and to please the organisation providing your funding.
You feel obliged.
You feel obliged, you feel obliged.
There are some really solid statistics showing that where there is an issue over electromagnetic field effects, that the studies funded by the utilities or by the power industry or the radio industry or by the mobile phone industry are funded by them, that the studies tend to be significantly negative, whereas the studies funded independently within universities and so on tend not to be so.
It's a challenging area in which to research. It's not easy to do studies of that sort, and because of the constraints of doing research in human subjects, you're not going to have perfect research studies. There are always going to be limitations.
Is this a real condition? Yes, absolutely it is. At present, the World Health Organization statements regarding this are that it is real and symptoms can be severe and disabling. Figures for electromagnetic hypersensitivity are around 2 to 3%. Those are people who've had their life extremely affected by this condition. But, as I've previously mentioned, on a cellular level, 100% of people are reacting. That means that the healthcare consequences of not taking this seriously and not recognising it are potentially huge. And the numbers of people that have mild or moderate electrical sensitivity are probably far higher than we estimate.
It leaves us with a tape recording of an experimental link-up between a standard telephone and a unique mobile handset. A dialing tone. And that's quite an achievement, because it's one thing to transmit a conversation, it's another to transmit accurate digital information. Now, an extension at the Research Institute in Chelmsford, which has perfected this technique. On the other end of this should be Liz Charnock.
With the advent of the mobile phone in the 1980s, came the need to build a network of antennas to support them. Since then, the telecom companies have erected over 5 million mobile phone masts around the world. But incredibly, prior to filling the air with microwave frequencies, they didn't conduct a single piece of research to ensure there wouldn't be any long-term health effects from such exposure. The grid was built without first making sure it was safe.
Thank you for your help.
So,
Pretty ugly, isn't it?
yeah, and it's constant as well. One thing you'll notice is it doesn't stop. It's 24/7. This is what's coming out of the mast. If you can see the mast, you're being exposed to it.
Right.
Frankly, even if you can't, you're being exposed to it if you're this distance away, because it'll pass through, concrete walls and things. It'll dampen it a bit, but not very much. If you're within 200-300 metres of the mast up there, this is what you're going to be exposed to 24/7.
When you can hear it, it changes everything.
It does.
Imagine if you could see it.
It'd be the equivalent of seeing a daily smog.
Yeah.
around you.
With a constant smog of man-made frequencies surrounding our daily lives, and no testing as to its safety, is there any wonder people's bodies have started to react?
Well, it was almost 10 years ago, and I was in my 30s. No history of breast cancer in my family, and living a really healthy lifestyle. I'd been living next to a foam mast for many years, over 7 years by then.
How far was that from?
It was 100 metres from the house.
Right, so pretty close.
Yeah, and for years I'd been having symptoms which hadn't related to the foam mast, because I didn't know anything about the condition of electrosensitivity then. And I'd been having vertigo, sleep problems, headaches, sharp pains in my head. And I'd often visit the doctor only to be told it was either stress or a virus. And then, just out of the blue, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And it was the biggest shock of my life. And at first I thought, well, it's bad luck, it's just unlucky, it's me. And started to go through my treatment. And it was then I started bumping into neighbours in the hospital. And I only lived in a small village.
Right.
And started bumping into other young ladies as well, who were neighbours.
Young? How old?
Oh, well, I was the youngest in my 30s, but the others were in their 40s or early 50s.
Right, that's very young.
And that was 5 of us all diagnosed at once, within 6 months of each other, with breast cancer.
There were only 18 houses in the village surrounding the foam mast, so Eileen decided to conduct a survey to see if anybody else had suddenly started suffering ill health.
What came back really frightened us. Lots of people were reporting the same symptoms that I've been suffering with for years.
So vertigo.
Yeah, the headaches, the vertigo. But there was other young women in the village who were having fertility problems and pre-cancer cervical cells. Other young ladies who'd had breast cancer benign lumps, and there were other conditions of cancer as well in the area. One of our neighbours, who was only 51, had developed motor neurone disease, and he unfortunately died. And so we unearthed a horrendous can of worms. We'd done a count of 77 people in the houses.
And out of 77 people, how many people
were
suffering biological effects?
The estimate was around 70%. People
70% of people
who'd had effects over the years with biological effects, sleep problems, skin rashes, benign lumps or cancer. Yeah, it was it had a big impact on people in the village. I think this is a global, massive problem. We found since then that we were not the only cancer cluster around a foam mast. There are many cancer clusters around foam masts. And we'd worked with a local scientist where we looked at other foam masts that have been in areas for a long time and conducted other surveys and found other cancer clusters as well.
With so many phones and masts, and a mobile phone industry worth trillions, you would hope that by now a strict governing body would have been installed, an iron-fisted regulator who ensures the telecoms industry errs on the side of caution, someone to set strict levels which protect the public, someone to ensure that what we're being exposed to is absolutely safe. Unfortunately, we don't have any of that. What we do have is ICNIRP.
Well, ICNIRP was set up in Europe about 20 odd years ago to look into non-ionising radiation. It stands for the International Committee of Non-Ionising Radiation Protection, and their job is to look at all the literature that comes out and basically summarise it, say this is what the science definitely says.
You can't get elected to it, you get invited to join it,
Right.
if you're one of the preferred people.
Right, got
So it's always erred on the side of industry because that's really where its roots are.
So what we've got is we've got a guidance standard which they've set, which has been adopted by most of the countries in Europe, and it's been something that the European Commission themselves recommend, including their expert body CENIR. But those guidelines are based on evidence that we know has a cause and effect for radio frequency radiation. So the only setting that exists at the moment for energy that's around the same frequency of mobile phone masts, mobile phones, DECT cordless phones, wireless communication devices that we're used to on a daily basis, is the one that we know works for microwave ovens, i.e. if you generate enough energy and localise it in a small enough area, you heat things. You heat tissue, you heat anything that has some level of water in it.
None of the current rules are anything to do with chronic health effects or cancer. None of them, not one of them. They're all set for heating effects and acute effects like prickling of the skin or your eyebrows going up or something like that, you know. None of them are for long-term health effects.
So saying that it's below 40, that means nothing. It's meaningless.
It's meaningless. It is not intended to protect from long-term health effects.
ICNIRP is just irrelevant. It's irrelevant. Well, for example, if you want to make sure that nobody exceeds the speed limit past a school, set the speed limit at 1,000 miles an hour. Then everyone will obey the speed limit. No one will exceed it. You know, everyone can go sailing past this school at 999 miles an hour and the limit will be complied with.
The advisory body effectively are not set up to look at the evidence with regards to safeguarding the general public.
So ICNIRP essentially there to establish what's 100% fact, and anything that's not 100% fact is not their concern.
That's right. They'll talk about it, they'll summarise what there is, what there isn't, and what's left to find out, and then that's it. They'll leave it there. No recommendations, nothing, because they just don't see it as their job.
What if I try and make a call? Let me try and make a call.
If you try and make a phone call, it'll be almost constant, because it starts a proper sort of two-way high bandwidth transmission.
Okay, let's do that. Oh wow.
So as soon as it picks up, this is it trying to, and this is once it's on call mode, this is now what the phone's doing.
And that's waves going from my phone to the base station and then being transmitted from there.
And that's it's picked up.
That's horrible.
And that's basically what your phone's transmitting into your head all the time that you've got it operational and you're using it for phone.
It's hard to imagine a piece of technology which has accelerated into our lives quite like the mobile phone. 25 years ago, it was seen as little more than a gimmick. Today, 4 billion of us own one. And the average age of a child when they receive their first phone is just 8 years old. The way a mobile phone works is by sending and receiving microwave frequencies to and from the base station. So having a phone pressed against your head inevitably means your brain is being exposed to those waves. Does the brain react to this exposure? A recent American study shows it absolutely does. The work was carried out by Dr. Nora Valko. Dr. Valko and her team studied 47 healthy people for an entire year. Participants had a cell phone placed on their left and right ears. One was activated but muted, the other was turned off. Dr. Valko used brain imaging equipment to study how much glucose the brain would use during exposure.
It's a very sensitive marker to indicate if there are changes in brain activity that may be driven by a given stimulus, which in this case was the cell phone.
When the brain is stimulated, it consumes glucose in the same way a car consumes fuel.
50-minute exposure to a cell phone was associated with increases in glucose consumption by the brain, which indicates that the brain was being activated by the radio frequencies from the cell phone. This right area of the brain that was very close to the antenna showed the largest increases in metabolism as compared when the telephones were off. Even though the radio frequencies that are emitted from current cell phone technologies are very weak, they are able to activate the human brain to have an effect.
By using a muted cell phone, Dr. Valko's experiment showed that the human brain has a metabolic reaction to the presence of microwaves from a mobile phone. A metabolic reaction at levels well below the legal limit. Something many people claimed was impossible. And the reaction recorded by the doctor is secondary to an even greater concern: the way that those microwaves are actually absorbed by the brain. This has become known as SAR.
SAR is, well, first of all, it stands for specific absorption rate, and that's the measure of how much radio waves, or how much RF energy, in this case radio waves, is absorbed into the human body over a certain period of time within a certain volume. So it's a measure of the heating effect that a radio transmitter would have on your body, on the human body.
The SAR for every mobile phone is measured in this way, using an artificial head called a SAM phantom. This is filled with a glucose mixture which represents the brain. The probe measures the amount of microwave radiation that penetrates the SAM phantom skull and calculates a SAR rating based on how much energy is absorbed.
For the European Union, the limit is 2 watts per kilogram over a 10-gram average of tissue. For America, it's 1.6 watts per kilogram over a 1-gram average of tissue. So the limit for the USA is more stringent than for the European Union, but other countries around the world, such as Australia, New Zealand, use the European limit.
Some of the most popular phones on the market emit so much microwave radiation that their SAR rating is right on the edge of the limit. Every millimetre of skull helps protect the brain against the phone's microwave radiation, and therefore lowers the phone's SAR rating. Children get their first phone at the average age of 8 years old. An 8-year-old skull is considerably thinner than that of an adult, so you would hope that phones are tested against a skull which represents the thickness of that of a child.
The SAM head is an average shaped and sized human skull. The average of 10,000 people has been taken in terms of their head measurements, and this SAM phantom head has been created, which is an average human skull.
Obviously, the head of an average human being is considerably larger than that of an 8-year-old child. But when we investigate the company that makes the SAM phantom head, we discover that the news is even worse. The SAM phantom isn't just the average of 10,000 people. It's the average of 10,000 US Army personnel. And US Army personnel most certainly have a larger, bigger, thicker head than the average 8-year-old. It's pretty reasonable to assume that if most mobile phones were tested against the skull of an 8-year-old, they would fail.
Who is it that sets the standards?
A group of people from a committee called ICNIRP.
The people who do the work on mobile phones are, by and large, engineers. They have no idea what is going on inside a living cell, but they are pontificating on this. They make the assumption that the only thing that can affect the well-being of a living organism is if it is powerful enough to heat the tissue. But that's like saying, we know if we boil an egg, it goes hard. What they don't know is that if they don't boil the egg, it turns into a chicken. And haven't the slightest idea how that happens, but yet they pontificate as if they do.